Hey guys, what's going on? It's Uberjakd here and welcome to Lessons of Dharma. Today I'll be showing you part 2 in the 2-part series, The Making of Shakuchi, our new track on Dharma Worldwide. I'll be covering some of the tricks I used to make the drop in this track. Dharmatic will be covering some of the tricks he used for the breakdown in another video, so make sure you go check that out. Let's get into it. Today we're going to be covering the drop in my track with Dharmatic, Shakuchi, which is coming out on Dharma recordings. So I'm going to be covering a few of the tricks, tips, and techniques that I use to create the drop lead in this track. It sounds a little bit like this. Okay, we're going to be starting off with the flute sample first. This flute sample here was actually how the track got its name. So back when this was just an ID, Dharmatic and I were thinking of names for the track and we saw the name Shakuchi inside the sampler here, Shakuchi 02, and we ended up shortening it down to Shakuchi, and I guess the rest is history. So what we're going to be doing is going in first. So this here was a sample, as you can see here. And in order to get the attackier sound on the drop for that better energy, what I did is I moved the sample start point here in the sampler forward just like this. About there. And that was sort of the sweet spot. To get the gliding pitch bend sound on some of the notes, I adjusted the setting glide, which is found in the pitch osc settings in the Ableton sampler right here. So I changed that from off, which is the default, onto glide. You can hear the difference in the sound like this. So this is off. And turning glide on. It's very subtle, but it just adds a little bit more movement and portamento to the sound. I also tweaked the attack envelope here in the filter global setting to give the sound a little bit more of a natural and remove a little bit of the click from the sample. The first thing I did was use the OTT, which is a really useful stock Ableton multiband preset, which stands for over the top, which was used to boost the sound, although it leaves a lot of low end as an artifact, which is going to muddy up the mix later on. So we're going to be using an EQ8 to tidy up that sound. So this is how the sound is when the OTT is applied to the flute. So I use an EQ8 here to roll off anything under 600k and really tidy up that low end. Finally, to give the sound some depth and polish, I use the CLA Vocals plugin, adding some delay, reverb, stereo widening, and EQ and compression all in one plugin. Okay, so the sound's starting to get some space now. It's starting to sound a little bit more polished and finished and full and not so dry and flat. But the sound needed one more thing, and that I thought that it needed a bit more space to give it some setting and make it sound like it was being played in a big stadium or theater. So how I did that is I set up a lead reverb bus, input coming from the flute here, and then feeding into my Arts Acoustic reverb with a reasonably long release time, and this is how it sounded. Okay, so the flute on its own didn't have enough body or tone, I thought, to carry as a drop synth. So Silent is used here to add a bit more power and body to the sound. Okay, so first I changed the wave to a half pulse, adjusted the volume of these settings, and change oscillator 2 to a pulse wave. And I adjusted the mixer so only part A of the mix is heard here in this synth. Next, I filtered the sound, adding some resonance and body to the low end of the sound. I felt this was a frequency that the original Flute Sample was lacking. So this is really filling in the spaces so the two sounds complement each other. I added some clip distortion to fill out some of the body and tone of the sound, mainly in the top end. The last thing that I used here was the mod wheel with the cutoff AB and velocity, adjusting the cutoff AB of the filter here to give it a little bit more of attack and to let the sound pop through the mix. So it's sounding a little bit like this. But as with the flute before, there's just not enough power in that sound. It's sounding very dull and flat and definitely not enough for a drop synth. So a few techniques I used here is I added an EQ8, rolling off some of that low end, boosting the tone, and this is when the sound really started to come to life. Next, as with the flute, some OTT was added. The low end was rolled off, anything under 100 Hertz to tidy up the mix and make sure there's plenty of room left over on our drop for our kick and bass, because we really want that to be nice and powerful in the mix. And finally, LFO tool for a little bit of sidechain. I used quite a sharp setting here, so not too much of a pumpy effect was given to the sound. The sound's starting to sound a lot better, but I thought it still needed a little bit more power. So to boost the sound, I've used OTT, EQ8 to tidy it up, another LFO because the OTT boosted up some of the frequencies to maintain that sidechain effect, tidied up any clicking that would be given as an artifact of the LFO tool, and finally we get the finished synth drop layer. And combined together with our flute, it sounds like this. The last thing to do was our kick and bass. The kick and bass were actually reused out of my own sample pack which I collect, and this one was a kick drum that I'd made for a track a few years ago actually for a release on Dim Mak. It ended up working perfectly in this track, so I decided to use it. And the bass as well was another sample from one of my older tracks where I created a bass for my collaboration with Fresh Till Death, Lose Our Minds, and this bass sounded like this. Together, we have the kick and the bass for Shakuchi. And the final finished product sounds like this. Alright, I just want to say thank you guys for listening to the tutorial today. Make sure you go and check out the release if you haven't already, and peace.